So, our usuals while everyone's getting settled, if you're using a phone, be sure to mute your computer and mute your line unless you have questions or feedback you want to offer the group. And then lastly, be sure to change your name on your Zoom screen to be your first and last name. That way, Courtney can put us in our breakout groups. All right, so today we are wrapping up the course. We're going to talk about how we can best communicate on the subject of climate change and then apply those tips and tricks to your own adaptation story. We'll review your homework, what will be creating that adaptation story, and then we'll break out into discussion where we'll talk about monitoring. All right, so session 6. What this means is you've completed all 5 steps of your adaptation workbook. Congratulations. This is a lot of work, and we're really excited that you've made it this far with us. You may have a few things that you want to tweak or finalize, but you should really celebrate all the work that you've done to this point. So when the course first began, we outlined the 5 steps of the adaptation workbook, but what it really boils down to are these 2 questions. How might climate change affect the resources that I manage, and what management actions could help prepare for those effects? So at the beginning, there are a lot of questions. You might not have been sure of where to start, and looking to us, our answer just comes down to it depends. These aren't simple questions, and there's no simple answer because these variables are so complex. It really comes back to place and the characteristics of that place, as well as the goals that you have for the land. It requires an understanding of location, management history, experiences, and observations of the sites that you manage to help inform your thinking on future actions. So these answers are really yours and not ours. Y'all are the experts here. We just gave you a tool to help think about these things and put it into practice. You might have also realized that climate change might not be the biggest threat to your ecosystems, but it's something that we all should stop and consider as we do our jobs and manage natural areas. There is and always will be uncertainty about the future, but now we know enough to begin preparing for whatever might come our way. We also have evidence of your progress. We asked you questions before you started the workbook, and then we also asked you some questions when you started step 4. So one of these questions is the idea that you can identify viable climate change adaptation strategies that can be applied to your local area. And a little over half of you felt that you could, but now most of you indicated you feel like you can. That's a big jump in progress. And then same goes for translating strategies into actual adaptation tactics. So way to go, everybody. You actually have the climate change adaptation plan, the final product of this course that is provided through the adaptation workbook. And you can download that and use this plan to reference in the future, such as when you're informing a management plan or another document that you might be working on. These can provide you with some of the science and research of these climate change impacts and how that translates into your decisions behind actionable adaptation tactics. So just to remind you of where we are and what you've accomplished, we wanted you to be able to practice adaptation by using the adaptation workbook process. Now you've done that, and now you know how to use it in other scenarios. You'll have these resources available to you even after the course, so come back and use this strategy in other situations. You've also used your expertise and local knowledge to apply these tools to your local project area. You've been thinking specifically about your location, what your management goals and objectives are within this context, and what risk you're willing to take for what you value. You've documented your intentionality behind your thinking and can refer to this as you implement future management actions. And then lastly, part of this process is creating a community of practice. Even though we're all meeting virtually, we hope you've had a chance to talk with others working on similar projects, that you've made connections, you've learned new things, and ultimately you've helped us improve this tool as well. So thanks for joining this cohort of practitioners who are thinking about climate change adaptation. So in terms of wrapping things up, what we're going to be doing is talking about climate change communication today, and then using those skills to shape your own adaptation story. We'll have instructions for wrapping up the workbook and then detail what exactly sharing your adaptation story will look like next week for next week's class. We'll have more details about that at the end of the session. Okay, so climate change communication. It's one thing to communicate the hows and whys of your new plan, but bringing climate change into the mix adds another layer to navigate when thinking about communicating effectively. As professionals, we're increasingly expected to integrate climate change into our work documents, activities, which means we need to not only understand climate change, but communicate it with others. And it's likely that you're communicating with diverse audiences who have diverse understandings and experiences with climate change. So some of these climate change conversations may look like stakeholder-driven concerns about your public lands, more prescriptive agency policies and guidance, or long-term economic forecasts. And because these audiences are different, your conversations may look different too, but there are a few standard tips to guide you through any conversation. And one of them is just knowing what your community thinks, who your community is. I can assume that most of y'all are on board with climate change, but what does the rest of our country look like? In 2019, the Yale program on climate change performed quite a few surveys to illustrate US beliefs, risk perceptions, policy support, and behaviors around climate change. They've taken these results of these surveys and put them into these really great illustrative and interactive maps that summarize how America thinks about climate change. On this specific example, they pulled out 6 different audiences that summarize America's thoughts about climate change. And we can see that most of the population is alarmed or concerned, has the highest belief in climate change, and is most motivated to address climate change, which is comforting to know that it's not just us thinking about it. And these maps can all be downloaded from this website down below here. We pulled out some information to explore the nuances of these results. So here we see that the majority of the US thinks global warming is happening, but less perceive it to be caused by mostly humans. And then even less than that who think that scientists think that global warming is happening. And here, almost 70% of people think climate change will harm plants and animals, which has implications for thinking about climate change and ecosystem management. So it's really interesting that almost 70% of the US population thinks climate change will harm plants and animals, and yet only 52% of people think that most scientists think climate change is happening. So there's this gap in how we're communicating about climate change with our audiences. It might be a lack of transparency in our goals or objectives, or maybe we're talking about it, just not in ways that actually resonate with the people we're talking about or in ways that make sense to the public. These maps are really great because you can look at these results by state, county, and congressional districts. If you look by county, that helps you get a slice of the opinions of the neighbors around you. So this way you can compare how opinions match state and the rest of the nation, giving you detail to your local area and what you need to know to create the most effective climate communication strategy. So let's take a look at foresters in Canada. In this study, they found foresters were more concerned with climate change than the general population in that country. Foresters also think climate change is happening as a professional body. And this makes sense. These people are in the woods just like you, observing change on a regular basis. They also noted that current forest practices are insufficient to address the impacts of climate change on forests. These results show that we're in an important position to share these stories with others who may not have the same beliefs and to do the work to create the appropriate plans to manage for climate change. In this study, climate change risk perceptions were examined across gender, heritage, and religion in Hawaii. Results showed what events people believed will happen at higher frequencies in the future under climate change and their level of preparedness for these risks. What's interesting is you can see there's a disparity in perception versus frequency. Indigenous and Native Hawaiians felt higher risks and even less preparedness compared to other respondents, demonstrating that time spent in an area, sense of place, and reliance on natural resources will influence how people experience and think about climate change. So knowing your audience is important for another reason, because their risks and challenges might look different from that of your own or your own team's experiences. All this to say, there are a lot of resources and research out there to get a better understanding of what your audiences perceive, believe, and value so that we can be tailoring our messages about climate change to them. Aligning your messaging with these factors will make conversations more impactful. So it's one thing to know your audience, to look at these maps and to piece together who and what your audience thinks, but it's a whole nother thing to really connect with them. Listening is a big part of this process. Creating opportunities to truly take in, understand, and absorb who they are will be critical to reflecting them in your work and harboring support for your efforts. Shared values can be an important point to work from because a lot of times they're truly uniting and they help audience recognize climate change as a personally meaningful issue. So trying to connect with something that your community cares about will be really helpful. So if they're passionate about wildlife, talking about how climate change may affect local birds could be really helpful. Or if they love coastal recreation, try to talk about how climate change may impact coral reefs or opportunities to experience beaches. While individual values are important, we also want to focus on self-transcending values too, so that people recognize their importance in the big picture. Self-transcendence means considering oneself an integral part of the universe and thinking beyond their individual person. It's sort of like thinking what you can do now to make sure that our children have a better future. In our communication, this can look like prioritizing healthier ecosystems that are more resilient to future changes, as opposed to making the messaging about immediate achievements or gratification that keeps the focus on the near term. And that's not to say that harvesting timber for money is bad. Livelihoods and subsistence are important, But getting your audience to think expansively and with the future and others in mind is empowering, and it shifts our mindsets to strive for more than what we thought was possible. In our climate communication, we also want to make sure we make local connections with local observations and impacts to help reduce what we're calling a distance issue in our climate change communication. So a distance issue comes up from thinking in three ways. The first is a distance in space. It's not happening here. A distance in time. It's not happening now. And a distance in species. It's not happening to us. And our poster child for this example are our polar bears. It's happening in the Arctic, not in Hawaii. It's not all the ice is melting right now. We still have time. And I'm not a polar bear. You're not a polar bear. I've never even seen a polar bear. So reducing that distance to reveal that climate change is happening right here in our very communities will be important to motivate important ways of thinking and behaviors that help support and help support our efforts. Connecting local issues to local action is more effective when you can also bring specificity to your examples. So you might say, we expect that within the next 20 years, we will see a 10 to 20% increase in 3-inch rain events, which could result into X amount percent of soil loss. You're giving time and amount specifics as well as resource specifics. It's helping your audience identify ways that climate change is impacting their forests, their watersheds, and how it's impacting certain communities and putting them at risk. And luckily, you've been exploring these regional impacts throughout the course for your project area, so you're all set on that front. Another way to make those impacts more specific and to connect to local audiences is to scale down well-known disasters into those local impacts, which might seem counterintuitive because we're usually told that individual weather events cannot be attributed to climate change, but talking about climate change that may make extremes more common and then thinking about the mechanics behind disasters can help us make those connections to our local community. So for instance, if we know that warm ocean temperatures and hurricanes are highly correlated, and we know that our oceans are projected to continue warming, what do we think that this will happen in terms of hurricane frequency? But another thing to draw from these well-known disasters is how these communities came together to overcome these challenges. And with these connections, making those local impacts well-known from these disasters, we're more likely to act in ways together to lessen the severity of these effects. And then when we're being specific about our local impacts, we can list them as multiple reasons for implementing adaptation strategies within our adaptation plans. So maybe we want to increase diversity in our forests and to reduce the risks of impacts like pests, disease, and warmer temperatures. Or maybe we're thinking about those local impacts of disasters. We want to reinforce some kind of infrastructure to reduce the risk of damage from hurricanes, flooding, and sea level rise. So this shows that the benefits of one idea can help reduce the severity and risks of many different impacts. So we're connecting with our audience, we're learning about their values, and we're making it specific and about local conditions and impacts. But what we don't want to get bogged down in are politics. Politics can be a real barrier to any sort of climate change that we want to see happen. So we can use some tricks to engage everyone in the climate change conversation, regardless of political affiliation. We already talked about local connections to impacts. to help people across the political spectrum have greater support for policy action. If we talk about big impacts like fire and drought and the mechanics behind them, that can also bridge that divide. And then going back to values, if we talk about values and themes that resonate widely with everyone, such as jobs, beautiful forests, and protecting the places that we live and recreate, that resonates with everyone. And then if we don't want to make climate change a political issue, we don't want to rely on politicians or the media to communicate about climate change. We want to use trusted messengers who use simple and clear messaging that are repeated often by a variety of trusted voices. So these trusted messengers could be us, it could be faith networks, health professionals, or other trusted peers in the community, depending on who your audience is. And then if we want to empower our audience, we want to focus on solutions and benefits. It's very easy when we shift that perspective from the polar bear to the climate change is right in front of us. It can be very scary. We want to avoid the doom and gloom though. If we emphasize the terrible fatalistic aspects of climate change, it's going to make people feel helpless and disengage. So taking that climate change mentality from doom and gloom towards I can do it can be helped with examples, specific ideas, and steps that the audience can do personally or locally to empower action. And you've thought through all of those steps already, and it seems like it might be overwhelming to provide those specific examples of benefits, solutions, and actions that benefit people, but it doesn't have to be that complicated. For example, maybe we're experiencing intense precipitation events, so it makes sense to simply engage in best management practices, such as planning harvests to avoid stream crossings, steep slopes, and wetlands. Something very simple that makes huge impacts and something that everyone in the community can get behind. So telling your adaptation story has a lot of benefits. It helps you gather support, helps reach a broader audience, and it helps communicate key lessons. More people are thinking about climate change, so the more that you're out there talking about it confidently, you'll have access to a broader audience and facilitate a greater backing. And this is helpful because you've probably already started thinking about how in the heck am I going to fund all of the adaptation actions that I want to take. But appeals for funding, they start with effective communication and storytelling. And this is also a great time to share key lessons. You're going to want to tell other people like you, help build their confidence in tackling this stuff, and minimize barriers that you faced that now they won't have to because you have shared your story. There are other benefits of telling your adaptation story. It's not only a chance to talk about climate change and how it's an integral part to your work and our lives, but it can also give you a benefit or an opportunity to highlight the co-benefits of good management. Taking initiative to phase in adaptation actions as part of a broader strategy can help achieve conservation goals while also helping to ensure certain goals are still viable years from now. Climate change adaptation efforts help us maintain ecosystems for the long term under a range of future conditions. So what makes a good story? I think we all have an appreciation for good storytellers, and some people are just born that way. But I think we can all become good storytellers with practice and some key pointers. We already talked about tailoring the message to the audience. Think about how your adaptation plan you describe might be communicated differently from, say, a board of directors or your direct supervisors compared to what it might look like if you're talking to a group of students or a group of concerned stakeholders. You also want to follow a logical sequence. You're connecting the dots into a coherent story. You'll want to include detail to a level of specificity that indicates that you thought it all through, really expressing that intentionality, and then backing it up with that sound logic and rationale. But be mindful that you don't overload it with all the information in your plan. And then bringing it all the way to that bigger picture. How does your story relate to climate change, to vulnerabilities, your ecosystem, all of the above, giving us that really great vision for what you have for your project area under climate change. And here's an example of a storyline to follow. You'll start with your place and purpose, and then move on to key risks from climate change that that place is susceptible to, that that place will experience. And then what are those adaptation actions that you will use to address those key risks? And then because you have done all of that, because of all of these specifics, what are the outcomes that you expect because of all of this? What benefits do you see to accrue because of what actions you have taken? And this might sound really familiar because you've already done this. Your adaptation plan has set you up with these key strategies in mind, and then paired with all of these other tips and tricks about climate communication, you're totally equipped to tell your adaptation story if you wanted. And that's good because you will next week. Next week's class, we're going to be using that time as a presentation time for you all to share your adaptation story. And that might seem a little overwhelming right now, but these presentations are only going to be 5 minutes. And this makes sure that everyone has time for questions and discussion. You'll have about a minute per slide, and someone will tell you when you're reaching your 5-minute marker. And this is really just to make sure that you're simplifying your plan into essentially that elevator pitch. Not every detail will be included, but we really want to know why this place is important, what's at risk, and what you're going to do about it. And we also want you to get creative. You have these really great visions for what you want to see. So maybe that's represented in Bob Ross style or a map of your place. But basically, we want to ensure that we're not seeing just text on these slides. And so we're going to send you a link to a slide deck template that you can use. You'll download it and configure it however you like, but it will basically follow the same outline for everybody. That first slide is going to be, where are we? Why is this place special? What are the values of this place? And why did you bring this project to our course? That second slide, we're going to have you mash up step 2 and 3 into this overarching story of what those climate impacts are that are most important to your story. You probably chose more than 2, but we want you to hone in on those key risks, those key vulnerabilities to climate impacts in your area. Next, we'll have you talk about adaptation actions. This is where you connect place and context to talk about why you're doing what you're doing and why is this the best action for the challenges you addressed in the previous slide. So this is also a really cool place to talk about the new and different approaches that you may be bringing into your strategy, what tweaks you made, what things you're keeping completely the same as before you started this course. That's going to be what's going on this slide. And then lastly, you'll have an outcome slide. And it's telling us what you're trying to achieve by working on this project with climate change in mind. This outcomes box really hits at why is this important and what is the big long-term outcome that you're going to achieve. And so again, we're going to send you a link to this slide deck that you can download and configure how you like. And preparing this will be your homework for this week. So like I said, next week, we're going to be using our lecture time for your presentations. So we'll also send a sign-up link for you to sign up for whichever time slot that works best for you. So homework in a nutshell, we want you to finish up your adaptation workbook to the best of your ability so that you can really summarize it in your project story that you'll present next week. And we want you to work on that presentation. So be sure to sign up for a time slot and prepare your presentation using the slide decks we provide for you. You have an opportunity to catch up on some climate change communication reading too. That's optional. We'll provide these articles for you as well. And then a bonus assignment that's not due next week, but something to think about is if you're interested, you can share your project as one of our adaptation demonstrations. Y'all have done so much work to think through these projects, and you have so much great information to share with people like you that it could really help them apply your thinking and your plan to their own place or inspire them to try something that maybe they haven't done before. And for this, we'll also share a template, and you'll fill it out and provide a few photos, or we can work together and draft it up with you. But these are really great and a really fun opportunity. And you can check out other demos if you're interested at this website below. So now I'll send it over to Courtney, who's going to tell us about our breakout session. We can also take questions right now as well too.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that fantastic presentation, Maud. So yeah, does anyone have any questions about climate change communication or your adaptation workbooks in general? Awesome. I'm not hearing anything. Feel free to type any questions you might have into the chat. And as Maud said, really what we want to do now is break out into our discussion groups and take a step back and really think about what we talked about last week as far as monitoring. And so in our breakout groups, we'll have a chance to talk about some of the monitoring items you've been thinking about, but also building on what Maud just presented for climate change communication, also thinking about some of those ideas and questions and other opportunities for climate change communication and suggestions of how we can be reaching out to our communities where we work and manage. And so that's what we're going to do for the rest of today, is really take our time in those breakout group discussions. We're not going to come back as a larger group after we've finished our breakout. So if you finish your discussion early, feel free to sign off and use the rest of that time to really work on anything else you have remaining in your adaptation workbook, or get together with your Hawai'is to really think about the presentation that you might want to give next week. As a reminder, those presentations are optional. You don't have to present on your project, but we really would love to hear some of your insights and key lessons learned and the process that you've gone through throughout this course to really think about climate adaptation planning in the areas where you live and work. So if you are willing to share and present on what you've done so far, we would really appreciate hearing from you. And so we'll send around that sign up sheet, and Maddie put the link in the chat as well to sign up for a presentation time slot if you're interested. We hope everyone does still come back next week to hear each other's stories and to learn from each other, and to use this as a chance to, again, share some of those climate change impacts, challenges and opportunities, and those adaptation actions and outcomes that you've really been thinking about as a part of this course. And so before we go into our breakout groups, I just wanted to remind us, these are some of the questions we'll be asking in our breakouts are really, what are your monitoring variables? So what are you trying to monitor to determine whether or not your actions are successful? How would you define success? So what is your criteria for evaluating whether or not your actions are effective? And what is your monitoring or implementation plan? How are you actually going to track those changes as they're occurring on the ground? And then again, any ideas or questions or suggestions around climate change communication. And then one other thing, we know that a lot of you might not have quite gotten to step 5. And as you're thinking about presentations for next week, if you haven't gotten to that monitoring step and you don't want to include that in your presentation, that is also fine. We're just happy to hear the stories that you want to share next week. And so before we break out as well, just some notes for looking ahead. Again, we're meeting on March 16th, and this is really that chance for you all to share your stories and your feedback on adaptation planning. And we're not going to have a lecture next week. The entire time, the hour and a half is going to be dedicated to giving you all a chance to present on your projects and share your stories. And so we'll send out more information and those templates for the PowerPoints. But the key thing is we really do want to keep those presentations to 5 minutes or less so that everyone who is interested in sharing has a chance, and we can make it through those presentations and share feedback and information with each other. There is daylight savings for those of us who are on the mainland next week. So we'll still be meeting at 9 a.m. Hawaii time. So that'll still be when we come together on Tuesday, March 16th. So I think that is all we have as far as the presentation and the lecture goes. And as we really do want to spend the rest of the time in our groups focusing on discussions. So feel free to talk about adaptation actions you're still thinking about, how you're going to be monitoring them into the future, and really determining how are we successful at implementing these adaptation actions on the ground, as well as climate change communication. And so with that, I'm going to send us all off into our breakout rooms. And once you're done with your discussion, if you feel like, if the facilitator feels like you've had a great discussion, feel free to end for this week, and then we will be sending out more information and follow-up emails and the newsletter, and see you next Tuesday, March 16th. So before I send this all out, anyone have any last minute thoughts or questions? Excellent. Well, mahalo everyone, and have great discussions in your breakouts.